Good morning, homesteaders, gardeners, and cooks. My name is Jennifer. Welcome to Miles Away Farm. I am making a quintessential fall and winter recipe, which is butternut squash soup. And I'm not really following a specific recipe for this, although I'm loosely basing it on one by Cooks Illustrated. The thing about butternut squash soup, and you can use other squash besides butternut for this. It does not have to be butternut. I have made some version of this, every year for more than 20 years, 30 years. And I've tried a million different recipes, and I've never landed on this is it. This is the quintessential recipe that will rule all other recipes, and I never need to try another one. I've done this with more of a Mexican and Latin flavor, where it actually had black beans added into it. I've done sweet versions where it tasted a little bit more like a pumpkin pie, and had, kind of baking spices in it. I've done curries, pumpkin and butternut squash curry is very good. I've done those versions. Oh, shoot. I don't want to put that in here. The simplest version, which is literally onion, squash, and water, or onion, squash, and chicken stock, or onion, squash, and some kind of dairy. So there's really no one right answer. Really, it's just about your personal taste. I forgot that I wanted to saute the onions in here first, and I got busy cleaning out this squash. This is a huge butternut. Honestly, it's really too big for one batch of soup, and so I might end up freezing some of this. The outside of it had some damage. Let me see. You can see it more on this side, so right here. And so it wasn't gonna store super well, and so it was the first one that I've used. I cooked this, I baked it in the oven for at least an hour and a half, and it's still a little bit firm in some spots. It'll be fine because it's gonna cook down in the broth, but yeah, really, really big butternut squash. It's funny how they take forever to get ripe, and you always end up with some that are just monstrous, and this one is really, really big. Have you guys tried the smaller butternut that have come on the market in the last couple of years that are called honey nut? And then there's a new one that's out that's, I don't know the name of, I'll put it on the screen. They are more of a personal sized and much higher sugar content. I have tried those. I grew some this year. I've grown them off and on over the past couple of years. They're good, but honestly, I don't really think they're any better. I mean, they're a lot sweeter. But I kind of like the old traditional, plain old butternut, where you get a lot of squash and you can do a lot with it. I got a million squash that I can cut in half and bake with a little brown sugar, delicata being my favorite version of that. And so, yeah, I don't really need a honey nut to do that. So in terms of the aromatics, which is a fancy chefy name for onions, garlic, things like that. You can use onion in this, you can use leek in this, you can use shallots in this. The Cooks Illustrated recipe called for shallot. I happen to have a shallot that was sprouting, and so I did throw a shallot in here. And then I'm using leek just because I'm still working my way through the pile of leeks that I grew this year, and so I need to use them up. So I'm gonna use leek. I've definitely made this with onion more than once. If you wanted to, you could add celery and carrot, the classic mirepoix. But everything you add to this is going to mask the flavor of the squash itself. And so the less is better in general with squash soup recipes, unless you really aren't a squash lover, in which case, by all means, add curry, add lots of aromatics, add other things. If you're really wanting to taste just the sweet pureness of the squash, fewer ingredients is better. I'm gonna turn that way down and add a big pinch of salt. And so this is one very large leek, which is probably the equivalent of 2 or 3 regular leeks. And then one pretty good sized shallot is what I've got going in here. And again, I'm just riffing at this point. The other thing that you will often see added to these to up the sweetness is a little bit of apple or a little bit of pear, and sometimes apple juice. I am going to do that with this recipe just because I also have quite a few apples on hand. And so we will do some apple in this. All right, I'm going to clean this other squash out and let those onions saute for a bit, and we'll be back in about 5 minutes. All right, these have been sauteing on low. I did add a little bit more, some olive oil to the ghee that I started with, and then a tad bit of water just because they were starting to get a little bit brown on the bottom and I didn't really want any of that. And so that helped slow things down enough. I'm going to puree this with a stick blender, so I'm not too worried about it, but I really want those onions to be translucent before I start adding everything else. Okay. So here's our squash. Here's the other half of this squash, which is almost 2 pounds. So this is about 2 pounds as well. I'm also going to add in 1 chopped apple. And then I am using homemade chicken stock here. You could easily use veggie stock and make this a vegetarian recipe. So don't feel like you have to use chicken stock. You could even just use plain water. And my chicken stock is pretty concentrated. So I'm going to start with this and see how it looks after it cooks for a while, and then I can add more or just add water to dilute it if I need to. Common spices that go into this, you might just go with a little bit of sage. Sage and squash play very well together. You could go with thyme. You could do more baking spices and add some ginger. So lots of different directions to go on spices. Honestly, there is no wrong answer. All right, I'm going to bring that up to a boil, and we'll be back. All right, we have come up to a nice simmer here. I'm going to let that go for 15 or 20 minutes to make sure everything is really soft and married. And then we'll decide what kind of spices we want to do. Taste it for sweetness, add a little sweetener if we need to, and hit it with a stick blender. These come together quite fast once you get the squash baked. Well, you guys, cook this for 20 minutes or so. And then I got busy with some other things, so I turned it off for a bit. Throw a stick blender in there and blend that together. That looks pretty good. I'm really trying to make sure that there aren't big fibrous pieces of leek in there, so give it a pretty good blend. The other thing I did not put in this, but you certainly can depending on your particular recipe and where you're going with it, is garlic. Garlic is very good in a butternut. And you'll notice I did use ghee in this. A lot of times the recipes start with butter. I'm not a huge fan of cooking directly with butter just because the milk solids in it tend to burn. It's pretty hard to, you have to watch it really closely. But ghee is butter without the milk solids. And so it's a really lovely flavor without me having to worry if I turn my back for 30 seconds that I'm going to burn it. So that looks pretty awesome. I am going to stir in, I have some extra evaporated milk that's been frozen in ice cube trays that I had in my fridge. And I want a little creaminess in this, and I also need to use this up. Whew, $9.19. Yeah, it's been in there for a while. I cleaned out my freezer the other day and just reorganized it, and am making a point of trying to go through and get rid of some of the things that have been in there for way too long. I always am throwing little bips and bobs of things into my freezer, and then I forget they're in there. So this is going to add a nice creaminess. You could use, obviously, whole cream. You could use half and half. You could use coconut milk, especially if you were going with a more curry flavor. That would be fantastic. Let me give this a quick taste. And butternuts vary a lot in sweetness depending on how they were grown, when they were harvested. And so sometimes you need to add a little sweetener. Sometimes you don't. I definitely don't need more salt, which is interesting. I think that chicken stock had a pretty good amount of salt in there, and I did not put a lot of salt in this. I am gonna add, I think, a little hit of ginger. And this is ginger juice, so it's just basically ginger without the solids, but it smells amazing and adds that lovely ginger flavor. I'm gonna try putting a little of that in there. And the recipe that I'm loosely following called for maple syrup. I might try just about the same amount of that in here for just a tiny hit of sweetness. This is a pretty sweet squash, so it doesn't really need much. I'm definitely going to add some pepper. If you wanted to add pepper without having it show up as little black specks, you could add white pepper. Let me see what that ginger did to our mix here. That's a nice counter. That chicken stock is really strong. That may not have been the best choice for really letting the squash shine. I'm definitely getting a lot of chicken flavor out of that. It's still really good, don't get me wrong. You know, the other thing that I think would be good in this is some poultry seasoning. I make my own poultry seasoning. Poultry seasoning is generally mostly sage, and I really want the flavor of sage in here is what I'm thinking of. But my poultry seasoning has pepper and a little bit of nutmeg in it, and then some other herbs and spices. I think that's going to be a really nice direction. I really am just kind of winging this, you guys. And I'll post this recipe. I really encourage you to play with your ingredients. There is no wrong answer. You're unlikely to go so far that something is really just yucky. It's gonna taste good almost no matter what you do, because it's lovely, sweet butternut squash. So a little bit of maple, a little bit of sage, a little bit of ginger, some evaporated milk, which is basically acting as if it were cream to give us a little bit more creaminess. Also to thin this out a little bit. It's pretty thick. Let's see where we're at here. Maybe some hit of acid. The flavor's good, but it feels just a hair flat. So perhaps a little bit of lemon juice or balsamic vinegar could be good. I think I'm going to go with lemon. It needs to brighten up a bit. There's always one. I know you guys are appalled that I'm tasting this with the same spoon over and over again, but this is for my own family. I'm not serving this to people. That acid really helped. It really needed a hit of that. It could use just a little bit more maybe. But yeah, that was definitely the right way to go. We're still early in the day, so this will sit and the flavors will kind of marry, and we'll have this for dinner tonight, and it'll be really good later in the day. There you go. So whenever you taste something, you make something, and you're like kind of meh, like this isn't a great recipe, ask yourself, it's the wonderful cookbook, Salt, Fat, Acid, Heat. So is it rich enough, which is where the cream is coming in here and the butter? Is it salty enough? Is it sweet enough? And does it have enough acid? Those four things in balance really make a recipe shine. And so a lot of times when I make something and it's just not great, what it needs almost always is a little bit of acid or possibly a little bit of extra salt. In this case, I don't think I really needed the salt because the chicken stock was pretty salty. But yeah, that little bit of lemon, totally making a completely different impression than when I started out here. So always think about those things. And I hope this recipe encourages you to experiment. Don't feel like you're locked into one specific thing. You can use this for whatever you happen to have on hand, what you're in the mood for. There's a million ways you can go with a butternut squash or any kind of a squash winter soup. You can make it all vegetarian. You can make it super rich by using heavy cream as an addition. So yeah, play around with this, make it your own, keep notes so that you know what you did when you hit on a really brilliant combination and you can make it again. But please eat butternut squash soup, super healthy and a great way to just basically make soup out of pantry staples. Thanks for watching, Tribe. If you enjoy this kind of content, please like and subscribe and leave me a comment. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.